Hi and welcome everyone to the CAA show. CAA, as all of you know, is Conversations and Analysis, and my name is Juggi Bhasin. The situation in Ukraine is a hair trigger away from war, and all bets are off that the Russians are simply posturing for strategic depth and acceptance of their demands. The possibility of Russian troops marching into Kiev is now very real. The crisis has not only sparked off a major confrontation between the Western powers and Russia, but has implications for the rest of the world, including India. To talk of this particular issue, I cannot think of a more qualified person than the former Vice Chief of the Indian Army, Lieutenant General Philip Campose. General Campos has had a distinguished career, and he's also an expert on what happens in that part of the world because of his experience in leading multinational peacekeeping missions in the Balkans in former Yugoslavia. General Campos, first question to you straight off the bat. Let's talk of the situation on the ground before we talk of the implications for India. Now we know that the Russians have annexed Luhansk and Donetsk in eastern Ukraine. Do you think that a march to Kiev is now almost imminent?
Yeah, though what you say, a march to Kiev is almost imminent, but there is a sense that there is scope for the Russians stopping short of a full-fledged war. There's still space for that pullback because as we would all understand what the Russians have been doing for the last few months, it's more coercive steps to achieve what they want without having to really go to war. And I think there is still scope to stop short of full-fledged war.
Okay. Now, you're a military man, and all military men, they make an assessment of what's really happening on the ground. How easy or how difficult do you think it would be for Russia to annex Ukraine, just in case if they do go to war, if they do send their forces inside Ukraine? Do you think that they have the force levels and the armor on the ground to do the job?
See, definitely when you compare the force levels of the two countries, Russia and Ukraine, you find that relative strength-wise, Russia is much stronger. It is stronger as far as force levels go, troop levels, as far as equipment, the quality of the equipment, the quantity of the equipment, whether it's tanks, missiles, artillery. So what I foresee is that if there is a war, not that I'm saying that the Ukrainians will give up easily, but relative strengths being what they are, and the fact that there is no likely external intervention at the behest of Ukraine, it's well possible that Russia should be able to achieve a swift victory.
I hear your words, General Campos, but it somehow, in a very strange way, it reminds me of something which happened with us, with India long back. And I'll take you back to 2002 during the time of Operation Parakram, if you remember. And that was a time when we had our own version of coercive diplomacy where we send our forces, to, in a way, to put pressure on Pakistan. But Operation Parakram, if I am not mistaken, was not a complete success. We couldn't really achieve some of the objectives in that it never came to a war. But something similar was happening where we had our troops on the ground and there was a lot of armor on the ground. Do you think that this kind of force level deployment in modern times actually pays dividends? If I remember in the Operation Parakram days, there was a lot of wear and tear of armor. Yes, we did send a message across, but we didn't fully kind of realize our objectives. What do you have to say about that?
See, that was a totally different situation. The force levels were not as much in favor of India as it is today in favor of Russia, both in terms of quantity and quality. of the equipment and the experience and training of the troops who are involved. And I think even there was no real clear-cut aim of that mobilization. Over here also, it's a question mark whether Russia will eventually achieve what it has set out to achieve. But in terms of coercive power, today I feel Russia is much better placed vis-a-vis Ukraine than what happened in case of India during that time.
Now, there were reports coming in, and again, it is not completely verifiable that the Americans had rushed in modern arms and equipment to through via media through Ukraine. In fact, they are in possession of Stinger missiles and other American weaponry. Uh, since you have been a top general in the Indian Army, and we have had Russian military hardware for such a long time, do you think that the Russian military hardware is can match up to NATO hardware if it really comes down to a conflict? Do you think that there would be some kind of advantages which Ukraine might still enjoy, even though they are obviously a much smaller power than Russia?
So when we talk of hardware, it's not only weapons which are handed over to you, but the proficiency in using those weapons and the experience in using those weapons, which become very important. And how do you use them tactically as in support of various operations of war? So just sending a certain number of weapons in just before the start of a conflict really is, I would say, it's not going to have the type of effect on the ground. Had it instead been units of the US military being deployed with those weaponry. So when you just give weaponry as a statement, as a political statement, it may still have value. But as far as a military effect on the ground, I think it's not really going to have that much of effect.
But then we also have the experience of Afghanistan now. And a major power, or in fact the world's leading superpower, the United States, had to actually retreat from Afghanistan. We all know the circumstances in which they had to retreat. Even if the Russians do manage to invade Ukraine, they manage to take Kiev, would it not be correct to say that for them to sustain their hold on that country would not be simple, it would not be easy, keeping in mind recent occurrences, let's say in Afghanistan and smaller places, where resistance actually can overcome even the mightiest of armies?
I agree with you fully on that. While a military victory in terms of securing military objectives may be possible and it may happen as per a given time plan, but it is what happens after having won those military victories becomes very important, as we have seen in Iraq, for instance, when mission accomplished was declared, but thereafter started the Iraqi insurgency and it caused a lot of casualties to the American forces. It's a similar thing in Afghanistan. The Russian troops did come in 1979. They did make an advance, a speedy advance, and take control over those areas. But thereafter, they had to pay a very, very heavy price over the next 10 years when the Mujahideen, with assistance from the CIA, got their act together and they were able to cause a lot of casualties, and that victory could not be sustained. I'm sure Russia is also well aware of these past historical precedences. And to that extent, like I said, one possibility is that they may stop short of war. And the second possibility is that even if they do undertake a war, it might be a very limited sort of war in which they will try their best not to lengthen their presence on the ground beyond what they consider is sustainable.
One more question on military matters before we, of course, come to how it impacts India. assuming they don't go to war and assuming they continue a kind of a blockade of Ukraine, in military terms, how far do you think you can carry a blockade? How many days, months, how much time do you think a country or a great power also has the capacity to continue a blockade when we're talking about Russia and Ukraine?
See, Russia is essentially on its own borders. It's not too far away. I mean, when we talk of somebody going across at a distance from the same country and trying to uh, carry out a military operation, um, it's a different, it's a somewhat different operation. But here, it's something which they have been doing for quite some time. And the Russians are quite adept at doing these sort of operations, being able to sustain these operations logistically, morale-wise, and otherwise for a long period. So I don't think that being where they are, there's going to be a real problem about holding on for a long time. The problem is not theirs. The problem is going to be the pressures on the Ukrainian military, on the Ukrainian people, and what this is going to trigger across in the region, how other countries are going to take this sort of what's happening in their neighborhood. All those is what is going to be more important if this stretches beyond a period of time.
Yeah, we will talk about that, of course. But one more question, you know, the we all know that in military terms, you had a lot of experience of the Balkans, for instance. You've been in that part of the world. It's not so much about hardware or it is about the equipment on the ground. It is also about how, as a people, people fight with each other. Now, there is a certain, we have different ethnicities, for instance, between India and Pakistan and India and China. But the irony in this conflict is that both the Ukrainians and the Russians are Slavs. They are actually of the same ethnicity in a certain sense. And therefore, do you think that it would even be possible also that they would go to war with each other? That somehow is a big puzzle. That's something which is not easily explained. And tell us from your experiences of the, when you were in the Balkans, because it was again the Slavs were there, and then of course you had the Serbians and other ethnicities. But isn't the ethnicity plays a big role in such conflicts?
Not really. I just want to clarify that I was not in any leadership position in the peacekeeping forces in Balkans. That was later when I went to Iraq. But in the Balkans, I was a lieutenant colonel, and I was on the staff at the force commander's headquarters. But definitely, what we saw of the various ethnicities who were involved in that civil war, whether it was the Serbs, the Croats, the Bosnian Muslims, they had a common Slavic identity. But as far as their ethnicities go, they were quite different, and they considered themselves very, very different from each other. And there was no holds barred as far as violence against each other was concerned.
Okay.
So there is nothing that I see in a common Slavic identity which is going to make them hold back from levels of violence which we may think are not possible. I've seen it all happening on the ground in the civil war over there. And I feel given the animosities, given the emotions, once if they really get down to war, it could end up being very violent, at least tactically speaking.
Okay, that's good to understand all these things, because one still had the feeling that it's like really the same set of people, and why would they go to war to each other? But you dispute this particular theory. Now let's turn our attention to India, and let's talk about how India is going to be impacted by this crisis if it develops and if it becomes really big. Sanctions, if they are imposed on Russia, are definitely going to affect the energy situation of the entire world, but especially of India. Our oil import bill, etc., could go up. But my concern would be on something else, and I want to talk to you about that. We have still a lot of military hardware coming from Russia, and especially after the deal of the S-400s. Do you think, if supposing a conflict, becomes big, if the invasion really happens, that this supply chain would be disrupted vis-a-vis Russia? Do you see that as a real danger?
Um, Definitely. If there is a war situation, you don't know how it's going to impact on things on the ground. If not disruption, total disruption of the supply chains, definitely there would be delays, as I see it. And that's a possibility. It may not happen. It all depends on what we have ordered, how much of it is still in the pipeline, how much is already manufactured. And but we've also got to understand that what uh, is going to really affect the Russians is economic sanctions. It's not going to be sanctions in terms of um physical sanctions, which may cause them disruption in their supply chains. It's more to do with the economic, their financial dealings, everything will be stopped. There'll be a lot of uh, what you call blocks on the movement of their leadership, individuals. Uh, there will be a lot of such stuff which is happening, and the focus will be on these two regions also, Luhansk and Donetsk. But we will have to see this. It's not definite that things can get disrupted totally, but definitely there could be delays.
But they
That
could,
I that, that
if along with the delays, you think there could also be a cost escalation of the hardware also, just in case. We are assuming if all these things happen, you think that the cost could also go up, that they might not, the treaties might not be honored in terms of the contracts and everything. There could be a price escalation.
it's always possible. It's always possible. We've had there is a history of escalations, cost escalations, especially as far as the Russians go. We've had this problem for a very long time. And if there are delays and disruptions, it's well possible there is delay, and this delay could well affect the cost of the equipment.
So there's lots to worry about for India regarding this particular conflict.
Yes. See, my sense on this is that where it's going to impact the maximum, as far as India is concerned, as I look at it strategically, India's worry is India's northern neighbor, and not so much what is India's security concerns relate to India's northern neighbor, and not so much to what's happening in Europe. So there's always a fear that if such conflicts were to break out in Europe, there is always a possibility that the attention of countries like the United States and European nations, who have been pivoting into Asia in the last decade and more, that they have been coming this side and moving out of Europe and the Russian focus and coming to Asia and focusing on our northern neighbor. Now, this has been happening for quite some time. But if such a conflict was to take place in Europe, there would be a switching of attention and resources, which would be to the detriment of India's security concerns in its neighborhood and in the Asia Pacific and in the Indo-Pacific. So this is something that...
So you're saying basically the courts could be affected, and the priority to court might not really happen if this happens.
Yeah, because it's not only the Quad. We have been talking about British or UK's involvement. Even France is talking of getting involved in the Indo-Pacific. So all this has been building up for quite some time. But if things were to take a bad turn in Europe, and if the attention were to divert, it could definitely be to the detriment of our interests. To give you an example, the very reason why the West, the US and the West faltered in Afghanistan was having diverted attention into Iraq. Because in 2001, when they went in, they were very well set up to achieve a total victory. It was only a matter of time, a couple of years, and they had a plan in mind, and they had the troops on the ground, they had the support systems in place. They would have been able to do what they wanted in Afghanistan in the backdrop of what had happened with 9/11. But because they got diverted to Iraq, the attention got diverted, the resources got diverted. So you messed up Afghanistan, and finally you had to resort to a very messy withdrawal, which has been taken, understood everywhere in the world as a defeat. So it is something similar, that when they have been building up, when the West, the Quad, has been generally recognizing that where the threat in the future is going to be, where the hotspots are going to be, and their focus has been towards that. But suddenly, if they all shift attention to some other place, things could start going bad here, starting with Taiwan, and then there is the South China Sea, there is the Indian border. There are so many places where our northern neighbor.
Yes, I was just coming to that, General Campos, because that's the other big worry which we have, is that besides diversion and besides their attention being taken away from Asia to Europe, the other big problem for us would be if China uses that as an excuse to go after Taiwan, or they could even launch an offensive in Arunachal Pradesh and Ladakh. Do you think that is a real possibility?
Not an offensive as we understand it, large-scale military operations, but anything is possible. With what we have seen in the last 2 years, see, there was always an understanding over the last few decades that at some stage, China would start flexing its muscles and start getting more aggressive. From the time of Deng Xiaoping's 24-character strategy, which essentially said, bide your time and hide your capabilities while you are preparing and building up. And ever since the last 7 or 8 years, we have been seeing a certain amount of muscle flexing, and we have physically seen the effects on it on the border in eastern Ladakh in the last 2 years. So to that extent, the gloves are off, the intent is quite clear, and it's a question of when our northern neighbor gets the opportunity. And if the attention is diverted to Europe, and if all the forces get pulled up there, there is always a possibility that things could happen in Asia.
At this point, General Campos, let's switch tracks and talk of two more important issues. One is that this is obviously a strategic, military, it is to a large extent a political issue also, but isn't this also a moral issue? At the end of the day, we are what the world is seeing right now is a large neighbor which is swallowing up a smaller country. Whatever the strategic concerns of Russia would be or not, but the fact is Ukraine is an independent democratic country, and this is nothing else but like you literally gobble up a smaller neighbor. So there is a moral dimension also to the problem.
Yes, I agree with you there that but that Russia would have to give a lot of thought before it really goes into launching a full-fledged war. And that's why I told you that my sense is there is still a scope for a Russian stopping short of war.
Correct.
But if you go into the history and you see what all has been happening ever since the breakup of the Soviet Union, there was a sense, even the United States, within their leadership, within their advisors, there was a sense that you have already won the war. You have defeated the Soviet Union. They have the Soviet Union is broken up.
Right.
So why persist with the NATO? The NATO was meant to defeat the Soviet Union in war.
Yeah.
And now that the Soviet Union was defeated, was there any sense in persisting with the NATO. And now that you had the NATO, you had a force, so you start looking for ways and means of keeping it busy. And so you went into a concept of getting the Warsaw Pact, erstwhile Warsaw Pact countries to join the NATO. And once that part was over, then you decided that, okay, get the erstwhile republics of the Soviet Union to join the NATO. So, it's where your policies, which I don't think were very right, have taken you and brought you to a situation that you have put the Russians into a situation where they feel that their back is against the wall, and they are responding in a certain manner. So I feel that when we look at these questions of morality, we also should look at other issues which have been under discussion even in the United States, where the leadership, there have been people saying that why are we persisting? Because when you keep a force like this, you're bound to look for ways to justify, and that this is where it finally brings you to.
No, and the other theory which is doing the rounds is that it's a good diversion for President Biden from his problems domestically. But leave aside, that's the concern of the United States. Let's talk of another very important issue out there. We all understand that big countries, large countries, including India, have what is called a sphere of influence. Like the United States has a sphere of influence in Latin America. And if you recall the Bay of Pigs incident and the nuclear flashpoint between Cuba, United States and Russia, and the way the United States reacted to it, and they actually won that particular tussle. We also have a sphere of influence in Bhutan, whether it is Bhutan or whether it is Sri Lanka, whether it is in Nepal. And then I take your point, then why shouldn't the Russians have a sphere of influence in Ukraine and some regions of Eastern Europe? Do you think this sphere of influence theory is actually guiding the big powers, especially now that the COVID pandemic is coming to an end, and the big powers are asserting themselves, fighting for a new kind of a system in the world? When you look into the future, what do you see that's happening?
See, my sense is this is a new Cold War. And the previous Cold War ended in 1991 with the breakup of the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was defeated. Thereafter, we've had this long 30 years in between, where the United States was taken as the sole superpower. But now there is a aligning of one is a perception that China is going to be the threat of the future. So on one hand, you feel that China is the threat of the future, and then on the other hand, you find that China and Russia are joining up. So when this sort of thing happens, so you're also strategically looking into the future and seeing how you're going to handle this joining up or aligning up of forces. So if Russia was weakened and you felt that Russia was not really a threat, but then on the other hand, you see Russia aligning with China, and clearly that alliance is very much there for everybody to see that you have reached a situation, because a few months back, you felt that Russia had its independent line, and though it was part of various organizations, security organizations along with China, but really they had their own independent path to tread. But suddenly, if you bring it into a situation where Russia feels threatened, it's well likely that it will get closer and closer to China. And then for the Western nations, they will have to see how to deal with not China or Russia on its own, but both of them acting in concert with each other. These has repercussions for India too, as to how this impacts on India's own perceptions of its own security. Okay. But this is something which could be guiding the way Western nations or the United States are trying to look at this problem at this point of time.
So, we're completely at the end of our time here on the program, General Campose. But last question to you is, and let's again switch back to India because we have to see everything from our prism also. We do still carry a lot of influence with Russia, despite the Russian closeness with China. Do you think a time has come when we cannot be fence sitters any longer, or we have this equidistance policy between the United States and Russia, and we quietly have a word with Russia and tell them that if the invasion were to happen, then we would have to take a stand against that? Because not only that would be morally right, but strategically right also for us. We cannot justify an invasion. Do you think a time for that is coming sooner rather than later?
I really wouldn't be able to answer that question. It's very tricky. It's for the government of the day to take a call. But like I said, it's a very tricky call because here you have got Russia, with whom you have a very legacy relationship of strong historical bond, and you've got the United States, with whom the relationship is more recent. The fact that this relationship has developed into a strategic partnership, that's a more recent development. So, and you've got China, whom you visualize as the threat, uh, for which you need the support of both these countries individually or collectively at some stage in the future. So, as far as India is concerned, I think India has to take a very long term view, purely in India's strategic interests, and it cannot afford to, get carried by the emotion of the moment and do something which India may have to
Regret later.
regret at leisure. So they
Absolutely.
will have to be very, very careful, and it may be better to be very prudent in the way we tackle both dealing with both the United States and Russia, as well as our Western friends in Western Europe.
So let's see, it's a very dynamic situation. We'll see in the next few days how the situation kind of pans out. But thank you so much for your time, General Campos, for shedding light on this very important, and I think it's a very significant issue, not only for the world but for our country also. Thank you so much for your time and for your words of wisdom. And we'll see you another time then. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jaggi. Good day.